Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette 150, and I do not believe it. I mean, quarantine started for me late March, and I am now at 150 of these things. We're going to be opening up here in New York probably mid-June, so I have to figure out what happens at that point, but maybe I'll be at like 200 or something by then. We shall see. So let's get going, because what we do here is we review random philosophy articles. That's why it's Philosophy Roulette, live on air. AI in society. This is the same as this morning, so let's see what to do then. Let's look at some of the stuff we had saved. Oops, not loaded. So let's load up some of the old stuff, and can also go to Phil Archive, see what's new there, and we also sometimes check the journal pages to see if anything has loaded up since frankly this morning. That's all it is. Elizabeth Barnes replies to commentaries. That's new. And then more biomedical. Yeah, I try not to do, like, there's so much biomedical research, bioethical, I should say, that's coming out that, try not to do tons of it, just try to do some of it. Alright, so we've got defeated ambivalence. These are all longer papers. It's kind of, oh, this one isn't, but it's more bioethics. I've done one of these also, one on this topic also. Maybe I'll do that one then. This one here is, this seems like fun. Let's see, the Gatecrasher paradox. What is the Gatecrasher paradox? Would like to know. Then arguing terror also. Yeah. Well, let's just take a look at this one. I forget what this is. See what it looks like. Okay. Let's see how sciencey is. If it's too much logic, I can't read it all. Although I have to say that the last one where it looked like there were a lot of formulas, the author did an excellent job. They weren't a ton of formulas, and really they were in like charts. There were formulas, but the formulas were in charts, which made it very interesting because they were using groups of formulas to illustrate their point. They were reducing the logic by the complexity of the logical situation by using charts of formulas. So let's do this one, though. This one looks pretty reasonable. Actually, that's why I saved it. This is from Mind Journal, which I haven't. That's why I like this one, because I don't get to do too many minds. They tend to be kind of long essays in Mind. So if you are live in chat, you can grab the link right now or type exclamation paper and the link will pop back up. And we're off. Awesome. Statistical Evidence, Normalcy, and the Gatecrasher Paradox Star by Michael Blome-Tillmann McGill. No abstract. Okie dokie. Let's find out what this is about. And chat, please remember to, if you have questions, please let me know. I will try to answer them, but this is my first time reading it too. It's not like I've seen this before. I mean, everything I saw was just exactly what you've seen. You've seen me load the fill paper page. Normic support, not nomic, or normative support? I don't know if I've seen this locution before, normic. That's interesting. Oh, this is interesting. Do I not? Wait. Is this not? Okay, this is highlighty. Okay. I guess it was, for a second there I got confused. My mistake. Martin Smith, in 2018, has recently proposed in this journal a novel and intriguing approach to puzzles in the evidence law arising from evidential standards of preponderance of the evidence. Puzzles such as Paradox of the Gatecrasher or Blue Bus, Red Bus example. Puzzles such as the Paradox of the Gatecrasher, the Blue Bus. According to Smith, the relation of normic support provides us with an elegant solution to the mentioned paradoxes. Here is Smith's definition of normic support. A body of evidence E normically supports a proposition P just in case the circumstances which E is true and P is false would be less normal. So we're talking about normality here? This is interesting, normality, so that's why it's normic, in the sense of requiring more explanation than the circumstances in which E and P are both true. Alright, immediately, I've said this before on this broadcast, I have lost most all of my intuitions about what counts in this world, so I have almost no idea what counts as normal nowadays. I mean, maybe certain things require more explanation as it says here, but I have no idea why that would be the case on any sort of general account. In fact, I'd actually say I have incredibly bad understanding because I write philosophy papers and people freak out about what I said. I'm like, I have no idea what you're freaking out about, so I don't know. I'm already like, I'm like not the person to ask about what requires more explanation and what doesn't. Okay, so that just said, let's find out what is going to happen here. For ease of reference, let us formulate this definition as follows, where square bracket expressions of the point square bracket P denote the circumstance in which the proposition P is true. So this is the circumstance of P. Alright, so NS. E normically supports P if only the circumstance of the evidence and not P is less normal, that means requires more explanation, than the circumstance of the evidence and P. Okay, as the above quotation suggests, Smith understands the notation of comparative normalcy at play in NS in terms of requirements for explanation. Here's another passage elucidating the notion. Abnormal circumstances require more explanation than normal circumstances do. Really? Okay. If ticket number 72 really did win the lottery in spite of the odds, then while I may be surprised and delighted, I wouldn't try to find some special explanation for how this could possibly have occurred. Alright. It could just so happen that ticket number 72 is the winning ticket, and there's no need to be more to be said on the matter. If, on the other hand, there was no sheep in the meadow, in spite of the fact that there appeared to be sheep in the meadow, then there really would have to be some special explanation for how this came about. Perhaps I'm looking at a dog disguised as a sheep, or I'm taken in by some strange trick of the light, or I'm hallucinating, and so on. Whatever the truth, there is more to be said. Alright, I'm like I said, I've lost my intuitions on these things, so I'm really, this doesn't elucidate anything for me, really. But that's not the author's fault here. So I just want to be clear on that. I'm not criticizing the author. This is usually my problem when I lack intuitions. Since Smith defines his notion of normalcy in terms of requirements for explanation, our above definition of normic support is equivalent to the following principle. E normically supports P if and only if the situation of E and not P demands more explanation than E and P. So this is NS prime. So this is just replacing the normal with the more explanation thing here. So that's just normal versus explanation, which is fine. That's what it was defined in terms of. Normic support, thus defined, is meant to be an epistemic anti-luck condition that Smith has discussed and put to work in other writings. Here we shall focus on his application of the notion to puzzles arising from the legal standard of proof of the preponderance of the evidence. Before turning to Smith's proposed solution, however, let us briefly reproduce one of the puzzle cases giving rise to the paradox at issue. Alright. I mean, I'm going to have to think about this, but I understand, cognitively why people would think this is explanatory. It's just I don't have that anymore, or I never did. I don't even know at this point. Yeah. Because, for me, that one ticket out of a million really did win the lottery. You don't need explanation. That's just how it happens. Or something, you got tricked by, you saw something that wasn't there. That just happens. I don't care. That's the same thing to me. It's okay. If you can say there was a trick of light, it doesn't matter if there was any of that other stuff. It doesn't call for explanation all the time. In some sense, I deny the principle of sufficient reason, actually, is what it is. I don't have to know. So, there isn't always sufficient reason. You don't have to come up with explanations. Anywho, the paradox of the Gatecrasher. I was just trying to defend myself there for a sec. Sorry. In most common law countries, the standard of proof in civil proceedings is the preponderance of the evidence, also sometimes referred to as the balance of probabilities or the standard of more likely than not. P meets the standard of proof in civil proceedings if, and only if, the probability of E given E is less than 1/2. Consider an example for illustration. The Gatecrasher version A. The organizers of a local rodeo decide to sue John for gatecrashing their Sunday afternoon event. Their evidence is as follows. John attended the Sunday afternoon event. He was seen and photographed on the main ranks. No tickets were issued, so John cannot be expected to prove that he bought a ticket with a ticket stub. However, a local police officer observed John climbing the fence and taking a seat. the officer is willing to testify in court. Given standard assumptions about the reliability of eyewitness testimony, the probability conditional on the evidence that John gatecrashed is well above the threshold of 1/2, namely at roughly 0.7. I have no idea where they got these numbers, but okay, let's assume that they somehow got numbers for gate crashing. I mean, how is that a standard sort of thing you get numbers for? But okay. The standard of proof is accordingly met in the above case, and John is found liable to pay damages to the organizers of the rodeo. However, a puzzle arises from PE once we consider a slight variant of the above gatecrasher example. The preponderance of evidence. Gatecrasher version B. The organizers of the local rodeo decide to sue John for gatecrashing their Sunday afternoon event. Their evidence is as follows. John attended the Sunday afternoon event. He was seen and photographed on the main ranks during the event. No tickets were issued, so John cannot be expected to prove that he bought a ticket with a ticket stub. However, while 1,000 people were counting the seats, only 300 paid for admission. On evaluating the evidence in this case, it seems again obvious that the evidential probability that John gatecrashed is well above the threshold of 0.5. Given the evidence, that is, given that 70% of the people in attendance at the rodeo were gatecrashers, the probability that John gatecrashed is 0.7. However, despite the fact that the standard of preponderance of evidence has been met in version B of our example, courts routinely find with overwhelming consistency for the defendant in such cases, and this accords well with our intuitions about fairness and justice, for it just does not seem right to find John, who is randomly picked out of the arena, liable merely because 70% of the attendees at the rodeo gatecrashed. If such a case was allowed to succeed, the organizers of the rodeo could, after all, in principle, win similar cases for every person in attendance at the rodeo, including the 300 people that paid the entrance fee. We thus face a puzzle. According to your intuitions, the court should find John liable in version A of the gatecrasher, but they should not do so in version B, despite the fact that the standard of preponderance of evidence is met in either case and to the very same degree. Why then, and on what basis, are civil courts willing to violate the preponderance of evidence so blatantly? Because they don't have the axiom of choice. You have to be able to choose something out of a group. Sorry, this is my some of my bugaboos. Like, the axiom of choice says that given a sort of a homogeneous mixture, you can pick something out. You can choose one. That's sort of, there's a big difference there between the first group where you already have the item in question and you have one out of a group in question, which is very different. All right, so, but that's something else, and really not these authors' problem. Smith's solution. Martin Smith argues that puzzles of the above type can be resolved by means of his notion of normic support. In the A version, Smith argues the evidence normically supports the proposition that John gatecrashed, henceforth G, while in the B version it does not. Thus, if we amend the standard of proof to include the reference of normic support as a necessary condition for conviction, the paradox over the gatecrasher disappears. For ease of reference, let us refer to Smith's amended version of the rule of preponderance of evidence as PENS. PENS. P meets the standard of proof in civil proceedings if the probability is greater than 1/2 and E normically supports P. To see in more detail how PENS avoids the paradox, note that in the A version of the gatecrasher, the evidence and not the gatecrashing demands more explanation than the evidence and the gatecrashing. That is, the circumstances in which the police officer testifies that he gatecrashed, he climbed the fence, and G is false, demands more explanation than the circumstances in which the police officer testifies that G is true. This is rather intuitive. If John in fact gatecrashed, it is not further surprising that if an eyewitness testifies that he gatecrashed, John's gatecrashing partly explains, after all, the eyewitness testimony. Not so, however, if John did not gatecrash. If John did not gatecrash, we demand some kind of explanation of why the eyewitness testified that he did. Was the police officer trying to frame John? Did she make an honest mistake? Did one of the actual gatecrashers look a lot like John? Since no further explanation is demanded with respect to the evidence and gatecrashing, but it seemingly is so with respect to evidence and not gatecrashing, Smith concludes that the evidence in the A version normically supports the proposition that John gatecrashed. Right. I'm going to stop being as curmudgeonly. I mean, my problems aside, don't really affect this stuff. So, I mean, the authors haven't done anything wrong here. It's just, I'm trying to figure it out how I would understand this in like sort of my little world. Okay, the situation is crucially different in the B version of the Gatecrasher. For in the B version, neither E and G nor the situation of E and G or the situation of E and not G require further explanation. In particular, the circumstance in which 70% of attendees gatecrashed and John is one of the gatecrashers does not demand further explanation. If 70% of attendees gatecrashed, it is not further surprising that John, who was randomly picked out by the organizers, gate crashed. Similarly, the circumstances in which 70% of the attendees gate crashed and John paid the entrance fee does not demand further explanation either. For if 30% of the attendees did not gate crash, it is not further surprising that John, who was randomly picked out, the owners belonged to the 30% of fee-paying customers. Thus, in the B version of the Gatecrasher, E and not G does not demand more explanation than E and G. Given Smith's definition of NS prime, that was the normalcy thing prime, it therefore follows that the statistical evidence in the B version does not normically support the proposition that John Gate crashed. Smith's account explains rather elegantly our intuition in the paradox of the Gatecrasher. In the A version, the evidence normically supports the proposition that John Gate crashed, while that is not so in the B version, despite the fact that the evidence support that proposition from a purely probabilistic standpoint to the exact same degree in either case. Alright, so I'm a little confused. Well, I'm not confused. I'm anticipating what the authors have to say, because they set up this problem and they haven't said a word against it yet. And a lot of times people tip their hand early. These people have not tipped their hand at all. I forget what they said at the very beginning. This is a puzzle, something, something, something. Yeah, so this is interesting because unlike the other papers, which I often complain about, where they tell you everything that's going to happen in the beginning, these people haven't quite tipped their hand yet, so I'm anticipating what they're going to say. So I don't know. I mean, maybe they completely agree with me, which never, ever, ever happens. But, so this is sort of interesting. So let's see where this is going. Alright, statistical evidence and normic support. So I'm excited. Hope you're excited. The idea that in the Gatecrasher case, the statistical evidence, the statistical evidence cannot generate the need for an explanation is rather intuitive and convincing. Yeah, like, I mean, that just might be a typo. I hope they catch that before it gets to print. Alright, but I don't know what statistical is rather intuitive and convincing. For the fact that a randomly selected attendee belongs to the large percentage of gatecrashers, or alternatively to the smaller percentage of fee payers, indeed doesn't require further explanation. Does this mean, however, that the statistical evidence can never provide normic support? Yeah, because this is using the logic of it. It's either you're going to be in one or the other. On a small enough scale, like only one case, you don't know which it is. You'd have to do something over the long run to really get there. So in some sense, it's okay that you didn't get. It could be in either group on the short run probability or the short run sample. To address this question, further consider the following principle, which I shall call generalization G. I like that, generalization G. All right. The fact that X is an F has a high proportion of F's are G's cannot in itself normically support the proposition that X is a G. G makes a highly complex statement about the relation between statistical and explanatory facts. To see exactly what it claims, we must reformulate the principle in terms of explanation by using Smith's definition of normic support, NS, from section 1. So this is G prime. The circumstance that X is in the situation of X is an F and a high proportion of F's are G's, and X is not a G, cannot demand more of an explanation than the circumstance that the situation is that X is an F and a high proportion are F for G's, and X is a G. You know what I don't like? You don't use F's and G's here and then also have the sentence be called G. You should have used F's and H's there, but that's something else. While G prime appears plausible to some theorists, I personally have no intuition about its truth value. Independently of its potential intuitive appeal, however, it is worthwhile noting that there are fairly clear-cut counterexamples to G prime and thus also to G. Consider the bark beetle. Interestingly, the bark beetle isn't threatened by climate change, even though 98% of insects are. This is surprising and calls out for an explanation. Why isn't the bark beetle threatened by climate change, given that almost all other insects are? To see that the case of the Bark Beetle provides us with a counterexample to G prime. Let us instantiate as follows. G prime Bark Beetle, BB. The circumstance that 98% of the circumstance that 98% of insects are threatened by climate change, but the Bark Beetle isn't, cannot demand more of an explanation than the circumstance that 98% of insects are threatened by the climate change, and so is the Bark Beetle. I take G prime BB to be false. As mentioned above, the fact that the Bark Beetle isn't threatened by climate change, even though 98% of insects are, is in demand of an explanation, and more so than the hypothetical circumstance in which the Bark Beetle is, just like the vast majority of insects, threatened by climate change. But doesn't G nevertheless appeal intuitively plausible at sight? As mentioned above, I don't think it does. I'm with you, author. That's cool. But there is, in principle, in the vicinity that is very plausible indeed. Consider random picking. Aha, so we are getting into the selection picking here. Okay. This is what I was initially thinking, that we'd have to go somewhere over here. The fact that a high proportion of F's are G's cannot, in and of itself, normally support the proposition that the result of randomly picking an F is a G. RP is true. It is not further surprising or in need of an explanation if the result of randomly picking an F is, against the odds, one of the very few F's that are not G's. But note that G and G prime do not state that the results of random picking are not in need of explanations, and of course they aren't. Rather, G and G prime make highly complex claims about the relationship between statistical and explanatory facts, claims that are by no means as intuitively plausible as RP is. Yeah, so once you randomly select, there's a big difference. And you notice right here, the Bark Beetle one, you've already selected a very interesting case, the Bark Beetle. But when you get down to here, you haven't randomly you are randomly picking. And if you were to randomly pick an insect, I almost guarantee you, 98% of the time, you're not going to land on something like the Bark Beetle that is not affected by climate change. Okay. The case of the Bark Beetle thus shows that, hey, and they say the same thing, yay! The case of the Bark Beetle is thus shows that statistical evidence can sometimes provide normic support for some propositions. As the example illustrated, the statistical fact that 98% of insects are threatened by climate change, together with the fact that the Bark Beetle is an insect, normally supports the false claim that the Bark Beetle is threatened by climate change. But the mentioned statistical fact crucially doesn't normally support the other claims involving random pickings. Imagine we randomly select an insect, any insect, and the result is the Bark Beetle. The fact that we randomly selected an insect that is not threatened by climate change is not in need of an explanation, no matter how unlikely. The selection was, after all, random. The statistical evidence, therefore, doesn't normally support the claim that the insect that we randomly selected is threatened by climate change. Yeah, it's in the one case. Again, if you take a group selection, if you get large enough groups of things, then it should, bell curve out to or whatever the probability should be. But if you're just going to pick one, of course, in the a sample size of one, you can't go on probabilities. I mean, you can, but you can't guarantee it. And so these sort of long-run statistical frequentist things aren't. You can't use a very small sample size on something that is that has to do with frequency, really. Okay. Anything else to be said about this? I'm with the author on this claim here. I'm very happy about that. And if anyone has questions, please ask away. The political gatecrasher. If G prime is false and statistical evidence does sometimes provide normic support, the question arises as to whether the intuitive appeal of Smith's proposed solution to the gatecrasher is merely due to accidental features of the gatecrasher example, and in particular due to the fact that it involves random picking. Remember that in the gatecrasher, the plaintiff randomly selects John for their lawsuit. Can we construe similar examples in which the defendant wasn't selected randomly, but on the basis of bare statistical evidence? Consider the following example. The political gatecrasher. The organizers of the local bullfighting decide to sue Lewis for gatecrashing their Sunday afternoon event. Their evidence is as follows. Lewis attended the Sunday afternoon event. He was seen and photographed on the main ranks during the event. No tickets were issued, so Lewis cannot be expected to prove that he bought a ticket with a ticket stub. However, while 1,000 people were counting the seats, only 300 paid for admissions. Flyers by anonymous anti-bullfighting activists were found in the arena claiming responsibility for the gatecrashing. So the anti-Gatecrashers came and sat quietly and watched the thing in the stands? That seems very weird for anti-bullfighters. Lewis is a 22-year-old political science student and belongs as such to a group of people who are extremely unlikely to attend bullfighting events under ordinary circumstances. A few remarks are in order. To begin with, the case is analogous to the B version of the previous example, except that Lewis hasn't been chosen randomly, but in virtue of belonging to a group of individuals of whom it is, intuitively, abnormal to attend bullfighting events. It is, after all, unusual and in demand of an explanation if a 22-year-old political science student attends a public performance that includes the killing of animals for entertainment. To strengthen this intuition, further assume that the pertinent evidence presented in court consists of the following statistics. 86% of 20 to 25-year-olds disapprove of bullfighting. 83% of people with an academic background in social sciences or the humanities disapprove of bullfighting. Okay. Given these statistics, one might wonder why Lewis, a 22-year-old political science student, would attend a bullfighting event, if not in order to participate in an anti-bullfighting protest. Was Lewis there because his family has a long tradition of watching the bullfighting every weekend? Was it because his sister was performing as a torera that day? Was he doing research for a term paper on bullfighting? Whatever the explanation may be, if Lewis did not gatecrash, an explanation is needed of why he attended. See, I don't care what Lewis does. Like, they're angry because they got gatecrashed. I don't care why Lewis went. Like, why does he need an explanation? I don't understand that part. But that's not, again, anything against these authors. Next, note that no matter how unusual and abnormal in Smith's explanatory sense it is that Lewis attended the event as a paying customer, it is clearly inappropriate to find Lewis at fault on the basis of the evidence presented in court. After all, Lewis could, for all we know, very well have been a paying customer, no matter how unlikely that scenario is given his age, educational background, and the percentage of gatecrashers amongst the attendees. However, while it would be intuitively inappropriate to find against Lewis on the basis of statistical evidence presented in the above case, Smith's standard of proof, PENS, is just as the original standard, PE, satisfied in the example. Smith's approach cannot, as a consequence, explain why the court should not find against Lewis in the political gatecrasher, is therefore subject to counterexample. To see this in more detail, note that on Smith's definition, the evidence in the political gatecrasher normally supports the proposition that Lewis gatecrashed. G, despite being bare statistical and intuitively unsuited for passing a verdict. Consider the two relevant circumstances, that is, the situation of E and not gatecrashing, and the situation of the evidence and gatecrashing. As suggested above, the circumstance in which the statistical evidence is as presented and Lewis paid the entrance fee, and thus did not gatecrash, demands more of an explanation than the circumstance in which the statistical evidence is as presented and Lewis did gatecrash as part of the anti-bullfighting protest. For if Lewis did not gatecrash, why did he attend the bullfighting in the first place? If, on the other hand, Lewis did gatecrash, the question why he attended the bullfighting does not really arise, for given the statistical evidence provided, we have an overwhelmingly plausible and improbable explanation, namely that he gatecrashed as a participant of the anti-bullfighting protest. In other words, E provides us with a powerful explanation of G, Lewis's gatecrashing attendance, but not of G, Lewis's non-gatecrashing attendance. In summary, E and not G demands more explanation than E and G, and given Smith's definition of normative support, NS, E normally supports G. I mean, again, I'm just like, this seems to be revealing more about our biases than about what demands evidence than anything else. But I mean, I think they're making a good argument here. Like, it seems like everything we already knew, everything we were already biased to think, supports one outcome. And if we are wrong, like our background evidence is wrong, then we might want to know why that is. So, in that sense, we're trying to understand where we messed up, and that's what's calling for the explanation here. Where did our reasoning go wrong? Now, I wouldn't call that normal, it's just our background reasoning, but I can see the intuitive appeal in some sense, wherein we think we have a good grasp on the world, and all of a sudden then something happens that challenges that, then we might want an explanation. Okay, so it might be objected at this point that it is unclear whether Lewis's non-gatecrashing attendance would in fact be in need of an explanation. Yes, please. Note in response that Smith leaves the notion of requiring an explanation intuitive and only elucidates it by appeal to examples. Here are Smith's comments on the notion repeated from section 1. If, on the other hand, there is no sheep in the meadow, in spite of the fact that there appeared to be a sheep in the meadow, then there really would have to be some special explanation for how this came about. Perhaps I'm looking at a dog disguised as a sheep, or I'm taken by some strange trick of light, or I'm hallucinating, and so on. Whatever the truth, there is more to be said. If we replace the pertinent details in this passage with those of the political gatecrasher, an equally plausible elucidation results. If, on the other hand, Lewis was a fee-paying customer at the bullfighting event and not a politically motivated protester, in spite of the fact that he is a 22-year-old political science student, then there really would have to be some special explanation for why he was there. Perhaps Lewis was there because his family had a long tradition of watching bullfighting together every weekend, or because his sister was performing as a torero that day, or because he was doing research for a term paper on bullfighting, and so on. Whatever the truth, there is more to be said. There is always more to be said. Always. I take it that these considerations are as plausible as Smith's original ones concerning the sheep in the meadow, especially so given the above-mentioned statistics. If that is so, however, then it seems that we need an explanation of why Lewis was at the bullfighting in the very same sense in which we need an explanation in the case of the sheep in the meadow. What is more, it is worth emphasizing that at this point that, just in the Bark Beetle example from the previous section, there are other closely related claims involving random pickings that do not demand further explanation. Imagine the plaintiff randomly selected an attendee, any attendee, and the result was Lewis. Imagine further that Lewis belongs to a tiny minority of attendees, namely to the class of fee payers who are 20 to 25-year-old political science students. Then the fact that the plaintiff randomly selected an attendee who belongs to this tiny minority is not in need of an explanation, no matter how unlikely. The selection was, after all, random. But it should be noted that the crucial point about the political gatecrasher is precisely that Lewis wasn't selected randomly, but rather on the basis of additional statistical evidence. Intuitions about the fact that results of random pickings are not in need of explanations are thus irrelevant with respect to the political gatecrasher. Okay. Yeah, so this is, again, if you have already been able to select an individual ahead of time, that makes a very big difference than if you were selecting from the get-go at random. So this is also the profiling that goes on. This is sort of like the profiling question in law enforcement, I guess you could say. Like, do these statistical things, can you impose this on a group of people and then randomly select a person, or do you have to know something ahead of time about an individual and then pick one of them from a group you already knew? So, yeah. We thus have, I take it, a case in which bare statistical evidence normally supports the proposition that Lewis gatecrashed. And given Penn's, Smith's normic version of the preponderance of evidence, the court should find against Lewis. Yeah, but you see, right here in my example of the racial profiling that has gone on in the United States, this is like exactly what shouldn't happen. It's like just because you profile somebody, that doesn't make them a lawbreaker. But that would intuitively be just as inappropriate as it was in the original Gatecrasher example. Yes. No matter how unlikely it is, given the statistical evidence that Lewis did not gatecrash, the possibility that he paid the entrance fee is not eliminated by the evidence, eliminated in a way that eyewitness testimony of Lewis gatecrashing would. The intuition that can be elucidated further by noting that, as Thompson has pointed out, what is wrong with the bare statistical evidence is that it does not rule out epistemic luck. One can have strong probabilistic evidence that Lewis gatecrashed, as the court has in the political gatecrasher, but it may nevertheless be true that if one gets it right, one does so as a matter of luck, incompatible with a just verdict. Yeah. So, yeah, again, this is the epistemic luck thing, maybe. We do want to know why our sort of background knowledge is wrong when we get things wrong, but that, again, requires us to have an individual that has sort of counteracted what we had expected the results to be. But again, we have to already know that the case in that individual. We can't randomly select one and then impose our statistical, the historical understanding on that person. It's the wrong way around. Because then we're just saying this is how you are, but that doesn't actually mean that reality matches up with our idealism is what it is. It's an idealism. Okay, normalcy, explanation, and integration. It might be objected at this point that there is a view that is very much in the spirit of Smith's account and that is not subject to the counter example in section 4. Consider the following definition, according to which normic support requires that the target proposition P explain the evidence while not P fail to do so. So NS1. E normically supports P if and only if P explains E and not P does not. Okay. This view, I take it, is just as well motivated by Smith's example. The example Smith presents in support of his view as NS prime R. However, before discussing NS1 further, note that the principle is, given the asymmetry of explanation, AX, equivalent to the simpler and more digestible NS2. So AX, the asymmetry of explanation, P explains Q, and then not P does not explain Q. And then NS2, E normally supports P if and only if P explains Z. Yeah. So yeah, you can get some negations out here and just do some simpler stuff. Okay. NS2 defines an epistemic property that Susan Hack has discussed under the label explanatory integration. What is crucial here, however, is that normic support as defined in NS2 solves the problem posed as the political gatecrasher. This is so because the proposition that Louis gatecrash does not explain all the evidence in the political gatecrash. For example, it does not explain why 70% of the people in attendance gatecrashed or why 83% of people with degrees in the social sciences or humanities disapprove of bullfighting. While this result appears promising at first sight, NS2 fails to classify version A of the gatecrasher as a case of normic support. This is so because not all the evidence in version A is explained by John's gatecrashing. It was part of the evidence, for instance, that no tickets were issued, which is surely not explained by the fact that John gatecrashed. In light of these problems, one might aim to further amend NS2 by demanding an explanation of only certain pertinent parts of the evidence, rather than an explanation of all the evidence. E normally supports P if and only if P explains part of E. However, normic support thus defined is subject to further counterexamples. Yeah, so once you start having to select which evidence you're doing, then you're again building more and more stuff in, and that makes everything more and more complicated. Alright, so however, normic support thus defined is subject to further counterexamples. Consider what I have elsewhere called the first of the gatecrashers, an example in which the defendant is, unbeknownst to the court, causally responsible for the gatecrashing at the event. The problem this example poses for the above principle stems from the intuitive link between causation and explanation. The fact that G caused parts of E ensures that G is part of E. Thus, normic support, as defined in NS1, NS2, or NS2P, cannot solve the problem posed by the first of the gatecrashers, for the defendant's gatecrashing in that example explains part of the evidence in the example. Can we find a yet different approach to normic support that fares better? One notable difference between Smith's original NS prime on the one hand and NS1 and NS2 on the other is that NS prime has a comparative element that is lacking in NS1 and NS2. To reintroduce that comparative element, let's consider the following principle. NS3. E normally supports P if and only if P explains part of E better than not P. Yeah. Okay. So now we're getting relative explanations here. Like, does one explanation relatively explain something better than another? Its negation. This principle is again rather well supported by the motivating considerations Smith cites in favor of NS prime. Note, however, that NS3 is, just like NS1 and NS2, troubled by the first of the gatecrashers. For, in the first of the gatecrashers, G, the proposition that the defendant gatecrashed, explains E, and not G does not explain E. It thus follows that G explains E better than not G, and thus that E normically supports G. Smith's standard of proof pens is again satisfied, an intuitively implausible result. Yeah, I think part of this, and because this author has been ahead of me this whole time, it looks like they knew what I was going to say and they got to it first, which is always nice. But the question, I think we're always biased to the evidence, but we're always not biased to the like the negation. And we think we like, does G have to explain E or E explain G or whatever it is? But the question is, what about not E, the not evidence? Does not G explain the not evidence? So I worry that we're not looking at the negations here too. There might be some asymmetries in the evidence, not just the Gatecrasher proposition. So there's something over there too, because it was like, does not E normally support not P, and then what is the symmetry there? Okay. Conclusion. Since the 40s, lawyers, judges, and jurists have drawn an intuitive distinction between two fundamentally different types of evidence, namely between individual and bare statistical evidence. J.J. Thomson has in an important paper observed that the bare statistical evidence does not eliminate epistemic luck. Intuitively, if one's judgment is based on bare statistical evidence, then one's judgment is, if correct as a matter of luck. Judgments that are based on individual evidence, such as eyewitness testimony, however, if correct, intuitively correct, not merely as a matter of luck. Individual evidence, in short, eliminates an element of luck that bare statistical evidence fails to rule out. Yeah, because you have to be able to know that the individual you selected is in the group you it probabilistically should be in. But just because you select one doesn't mean it actually is a member of that group. So again, the selection is super important here. Smith's normic approach to the paradox of the gatecrasher and to related puzzles in evidence law is very much in the tradition of this distinction. It can be fruitfully understood as an attempt to explicate the notion of individual evidence, and thus as an attempt to produce an epistemic anti-luck condition. However, just like the competing accounts of individual evidence and epistemic luck, such as Thomson's 86 causal account and Enoch et al.'s 2012 sensitivity account, Smith's approach is subject to counterexample. This is presumably not only problematic for Smith's attempted solution of the paradox of the gatecrasher, but also for his larger epistemological project, built around the idea that normic support is a successful epistemic anti-luck condition. The philosophical debate on the paradox of the gatecrasher is still in its infancy. However, there is a common assumption underlying the current debate, namely the idea that the paradox must be resolved by distinguishing and then analyzing or defining two fundamentally different types of evidence. It is my opinion that this approach is misguided. Knowledge is the ultimate epistemic anti-luck condition. I thus contend that a successful approach to the problems at hand must put knowledge first. A knowledge-first account of the mentioned puzzles, however, shall be the topic for another occasion. Yeah, I have no idea what knowledge first is. I will be looking forward to this author's account, since I mostly ended up agreeing with, I mean, it's one of these times when I don't always agree with how they argued for it, but I agreed with their conclusions basically 100%. So, which is nice. I mean, it's like, there's more than one way to be right about these things. Like I said, I deny the principle of sufficient reason, so you can do things in more than one way, and that's cool. So, let's see, anything else to be said? This, I think was actually, for this kind of paper, was very well written, first of all. This is, I mentioned to some people before, people have asked me, about like what's good papers. I said, well, I can tell the difference between like the young philosophers and the older ones, or at least people have they try to get a little bit more expansive, I think, when they get a little older. So you see, they're referencing 86, 2012. They're not like just trying to poke at the people from the last few years. So this seems a little bit more expansive in some sense. So you've got 2015 things, but then we're also referencing things from a few years back. Even though this is all new stuff, see, like this 2000. So this is nice because it sort of pulls together a few different different threads from different areas. It's got this political, not the political, it's got this sort of legal bent to it, but it's really pulling in explanatory stuff, like the philosophy of explanation here, which is interesting, and how that applies. So I like this paper for the fact that it seems to pull a few different things together to make a nice point to show that in the legal case you really can't use statistical evidence to solve your problem of what actually happened. Okay, So anything else do I have to say here? Minor typos, but that's not too bad. Hopefully they'll be corrected in the final version. Yeah, and again, oh, yeah, the problem of explanation. What calls for explanation? What calls for explanation? What is that anything more than our biases? I mean, what is the ontological status of explanation? I don't know. Like I said, I've lost most of my my intuitions on all these things at this point. So why should, like, so if somebody went to the bullfighting and he didn't happen to fall into the statistical like silos that we had classified for Lewis. Like, yeah, so what? Like, I don't care. Like, that's nice. What are you even trying to explain? Why are these people even angry about them getting gatecrashed? They lost money, and so they're saying, well, it probably is him. Well, if it probably is him is a good reason to go check in to see if he did gatecrash, but, like, it's not any reason to convict him. Gatecrashing, again, is like, they can't do that. That's just profiling. And profiling has been shown to be wrong. I mean, not entirely wrong. It's the people you have more likelihood to look at. It's like one of those, like, if you, like, it's always the dumb explanation that's right. It's like if you think like a husband killed his wife, more likely than not you're going to be right about that. But not every time. Sometimes it's somebody else that did it. It's you can't just assume at the get-go based on the history. Things change over time. So just because something was like this in the past. That's one of the things. All the evidence you have is based on historical data. History is not right now. It may inform us, it may educate us, it may give us an understanding of nowadays things, but using the historical data does not make, we're not governed by it. It's like, just because a history has been that way doesn't mean it's the same thing forever. This is not, even if you think natural laws are sort of fixed, people do not follow natural laws. Like, we are not based, like, human interactions is not explained by physics, at least not in any time soon. So, the question is, why are we using statistics and we think people are just going to follow statistics? That's a good question. Why do we think that? So yeah. Alright, so that's about it for now. No questions from the Twitch gallery out there, I guess. Please let me know if I said something silly, which I'm sure I did. But yeah, I like this because it was, for this sort of topic, causality and statistics and explanation, it was well written. I thought reasonably well explained. And that's it. Okay, have a good night, folks. I'll be back tomorrow, I believe. Yep. Thank you. Have a good night. Stay safe.